Hello.
Hey, sorry, I was having Zoom issues, but we're here. I'll give folks a little bit of time to join. See people trickling in now that meeting's officially open. I'm pasting the notes doc in the Zoom chat. I also just pasted it in the Slack channel for folks. And people are looking for the Zoom link because we make them hard right now as a community to find. I'm going to go ahead and start since it's already 4 past. This is a official Kubernetes meeting like all the normal ones. It is being recorded. We have a code of conduct and expect that folks follow it. Know that this will be on the internet forever, so behave accordingly. Welcome everybody to what's technically our second Workgroup LTS meeting. We had a initial one with just a couple of attendees 2 weeks ago that was sort of like unannounced yet because we were still getting things in line to get announced. But we actually had a pretty good discussion, I feel like, and the recording of that is on YouTube already. We were still dealing with Zoom credentials and YouTube credentials and all of that startup stuff. So it's out there. But this, I feel like, is kind of the first real meeting because we've had a little bit more of an announcement and obviously have more folks here. So welcome to everybody. I don't know if folks want to do a little bit of a short intro since we've got more people here, just kind of mention why you're here, what you're interested in. Would folks like to do that for a start for a few minutes? Or just dive in to topics?
Hey, hi, this is Tabal here. I'm another co-organizer of this meetup. I'm going to take up the role for note taker today.
Oh yeah,
Just
thank
wanted
you.
to join in and yeah.
Oh, and I should mention, I'm Tim Pepper. If you don't know me, I just changed my name from Workgroup LTS to Tim Pepper. I work at VMware. We have an interest in how one operates and deploys Kubernetes and supports it over time. So that's kind of our angle on this. But why don't we, I guess nobody said yes or no, but I'm just going to go through and call on people. So Roger, you're next in my list.
Cool. Lucky me. So I'm a product manager for SUSE CAS platform, Containers as a Service. And LTS is a big part of our Linux business, and we are hearing much stronger requests from some of our customers, the ones who aren't rolling with every single thing we throw at them, for a long-term support strategy and a less frequent update strategy from us that is coherent.
Makes sense. Arnaud, I don't know if it looks like you may just be joining the. I'll circle back to you based on what it's showing. Daval, is there anything else you wanted to say? You're next on the attendee list.
Hey, I am a programmer at VMware, and my interest in LTS started when the working group started when I joined in 1.12 release, and I found there were a lot of things that people were raising about the release cycle, and I thought there were a lot of problems that needs to be fixed. So that's why I thought that a working group to discuss all the different possible solutions to this problem needs to be discussed. There needs to be a single platform where all of us different stakeholders can connect and join. Sorry, I'm having a throat issue, so if you're hearing,
Yeah,
that's
we're
not my
hearing you.
voice.
Okay, thanks. Jim Angel.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. So I'm Jim Angel. I'm a cloud administrator at General Motors, supporting the Kubernetes deployment, also Pivotal Cloud Foundry. We're currently on 1.9.6 in production, and we're having struggles with the upgrade strategy and the release cycle there. And being part of the release cycle, I see all of what goes into it and kind of have a good pulse on what's going on and what's coming through. So it's not really an issue as far as knowing what's coming down the road. It's the enterprise roadblocks of being able to upgrade every 3 months. And so I'm not saying that long-term or the LTS long-term support is really what we need per se, but I'm really interested in this discussion, the direction of where it's going, and kind of the general thoughts of the community, so I can be aligned with that as we create our own upgrade strategy here at General Motors.
I think that's one of the key things we want to do is just be understanding what people are seeing, cataloging that, and then doing some definitions. Like one of the initial questions as well, what do you mean by LTS? And certain people hear certain things there. And is that the answer, or is something else the answer, that we explore this openly? Jordan Liggett.
Hey, I'm Jordan Liggett. I'm at Google now. I was at Red Hat for a few years before that, so I've worked with a lot of hosted and on-premise installations, and look a lot at API compatibility, config compatibility across releases. And I'm really interested in trying to reduce pain of upgrades and find out what is painful about upgrades and how can we make those non-events, both in how we prepare for them and what we do in the Kubernetes project and how we communicate out to our users. So
cool. Jorge Alarcon.
Yes. Hi, everyone. I'm a software engineer at the Texas Advanced Computing Center. I'm actually a relatively new contributor to the whole Kubernetes community, so I'm still getting I'm still trying to get the whole hang of all the working groups, SIGs, and all that. But yeah, I got interested in the working group also to try to see where I can help and try and make upgrades as painless as possible.
Cool. Justin Santa Barbara.
Hi, I'm Justin Santa Barbara. I work at Google. I guess my interest in LTS primarily comes from my work on COPS, where we essentially help people, manage their Kubernetes clusters. And so I'm interested to see whether we can have a long-term support option for that.
And Lubomir.
Hi, this is Lubomir. I work for VMware in the same office as Steve Pepper. Mostly in Kubernetes, I mostly work in kubeadm, and since VMware is interested in LTS, I'm also interested.
Mark Johnson.
Hi, I'm another VMware engineer interested in enterprises running Kubernetes and making it easy for them to run and upgrade and support it for long term. So I'll be lurking here.
And Quinton, one of the people we tagged as a co-organizer and got to volunteer.
Hi, yes, and sorry I'm late. I'm Quinton. I think I probably have run into more than one of you more than once. Tim asked me to kind of provide some insight here, and also from Huawei's side, we have lots of Kubernetes-based products, both on-premise and public cloud, and all of them struggle with version compatibility issues and managing long-term support, particularly for enterprise customers.
And Tim St. Clair.
Hi, I'm Tim St. Clair. I currently work for Heptio, soon to be VMware, in the coming weeks, months. For those who don't know, I have a long history in this space of long-term support. In fact, Tim Hawkins and I started what can best be described as a nerd fight a long time ago, and then we started an email thread which had this conversation piece, which then led into his talk, and then also sprawled into the other topics. And I know I kind of poke the hornet's nest repeatedly on this. The reason why I care about this so much is, in being a SIG cluster lifecycle lead, we often see the pain that customers or users go through with regards to management of their clusters over time, and the forced upgrade scenario that kind of is incurred because of the velocity of the project. And because of that, there's several thoughts and ideas we've had over time around this, and I think it's been a long time coming, and I think that we really need to start to address these issues as a community, because our users are clamoring for this. They've been screaming loudly into the void, and I think it's best to put some requirements and some documentation and some design thought into how we can address those issues.
totally agree. Tim Hawkins' talk last year at KubeCon, like totally resonated with me. But then somehow you got to start driving this into action. We can throw some ideas out there, talk about what it might be, but then at some point, some of us have it's open source. We got to make it happen if we like it, want it, and we see the user pain. So, Zach Shepard.
Hi, I'm Zach. I'm also a software engineer at VMware, interested in many of the things others have already mentioned.
Well, cool. Well, welcome everybody. If you could also drop your name in the minutes, just so we're tracking, just in the normal community ways, who's present and what we're talking about, that would be awesome. Davos did a little bit of scribing also about who's where, who's doing what.
Yeah, I'd like people to help me with the edits if your section, yeah.
And I'd encourage people too, like I'm somewhat surprised the number of VMware people on the call today, but help start spreading the word. Like one of the things that I really want to get here is a good diversity, not just in like the corporate sponsor side of things, but in the Kubernetes user base or developer base. Both of those need to be present here. And like that was part of the reason I'd reached out to Quentin as somebody as a co-organizer, like the Huawei company perspective and the set of users that they support. We need more of those to have a really well-rounded conversation about what our requirements and figuring out what a forward path here might be. So I threw a couple of things on the agenda. Yeah, go ahead.
So yeah, Nick wanted to join in but could not join in because of a personal commitment. He wanted me to put in a word saying, apologizing to the group. Yep.
Yeah, okay.
Yep.
So we have, this is something else I guess we'll need to talk about eventually, but we have people in broader time zones who are interested in participating also. So I want to set up a second time meeting to try and pull in some of those folks. So I'll maybe do a doodle or something and try and get more folks. Nick is in Australia particularly, but 2 weeks ago now at KubeCon China, I talked to a number of folks who are interested in being involved in these discussions and are interested in the outcomes as well. So yeah, we'll figure that out. We've got KubeCon coming up in just a little while again, North America, and then the end of year holidays around the world as well. So I think things are probably going to be a little disjointed, but hopefully in January we can then start regular meetings on a schedule that pulls in people broadly. So I've thrown a couple things on the agenda for the day to try and talk about. I guess, so the three of them, there's a version SKU documentation PR out against the website. We've got just the work group creation where I'd thrown like some thoughts on a draft charter out there as well that's generated discussion. And then one of the things that we want to try and get moving as soon as possible is something for a survey. So we'd started a Google Doc on that. So have folks here seen that first one, the website poll 11060? Do people have thoughts on it? Jordan, do you have things you want to bring up here?
I tried to kind of call out some of the open questions that were being raised by people in comments, and also questions that I asked myself while I was writing it. Those kind of break down into two categories. One is around like specific components, so I'm still hunting down representatives that maintain those components to try to understand what they test, what their expectations are, what they support. But then there were a few broader questions specifically around kind of upgrade testing. Currently, we only test latest patch level to latest patch level, and then there was also a question around downgrade support. So I'm trying to break all of the questions down to things that are just recognizing the current state of the project so that we can document that and actually get that clear for people who are trying to maintain clusters with what we have today. But then also take the questions that are raised where things are ambiguous or people have different expectations and iterate on this. And iterating will require updating this document, but also reaching agreement on areas that are currently vague. So I'm trying to divide that into two sets of questions so that we can actually merge this and provide useful information to users who don't have it today, but then keep discussing this. Here, SIG architecture are probably the two kind of cross-cutting SIGs that come to mind. SIG release, SIG testing, those are the cross-cutting ones, but then it has implications for lots of individual pieces. So that's an overview. Yeah.
I guess kind of echoing Tim St. Clair, like you're kind of kicking the nest with this, but it's really timely and needed. So the conversation has started out good, and like you say, going out and finding the people and nudging them to chime in. One question that I had, I don't know if I put this in the PR, but there'd been a little bit of discussion about, as we catalog this, where it should live. Like, do you feel a website is the right place, or, I mean, certainly it should be visible ultimately in the website, and that's an easy place to make a first PR now, and we can iterate, but do you think that's the right place long-term?
That's where a lot of our formal guarantee documentation lives. So like the deprecation policy, that's the canonical place for that. When I think if you have sort of authoritative documentation somewhere else and website documentation that is like a projection or an updated copy of that, those are inevitably going to drift.
Exactly,
and
yeah.
Formal guarantees and what we support are not the kinds of documents you want to drift. Like, you want everyone's understanding to be the same. So
would one of your goals then be, like, once this merges, to do some PRs against K community and remove some things there?
Probably clean up, remove, take out content and refer to the website document. Yeah.
Okay. The other thing then with that is some of, I don't know how much this is going to end up being, like, I think you've done a good job of being agnostic and not getting into like a list of components and versions specifically. But I wonder, like, the kernel versus distro talk, at some point, like, things start looking like a distro and you end up with a list of supported, like a support matrix.
Yeah, I think, is it Aaron? I forget who raised the question about like third-party dependencies.
Mm-hmm.
And as soon as you start, like, I agree that is needed. I would like that to be a follow-up. Otherwise, it'll be a year before this merges.
Yeah.
But definitely a matrix of, like, what do we test with? What versions of etcd do we test with? What container runtimes do we test with? And what we test with and what we support, I'm not sure what support means for an open source project. Like, is support provided by the open source project or by vendors? Those are all good questions, and I think that information is important to provide. I would like to figure out how best to provide that.
Okay, Tim?
We've had this conversation in the SIG cluster lifecycle space for a long time of what support means and what things are in purview and what things are out of purview. Yeah. And we explicitly, in the creation of kubeadm, we explicitly stated that it's only the management of the control plane components that are required, right? And the version skew within the control plane. Anything else has been punted to add-ons. So even CNI integration or CSI integration or whatever you want to call it, because that limits and bounds the scope. But then you still have some things that are in that space, like the CRI, which are required in order for you to actually do validation and verification, right? So I think enumerating, I don't think it's required for your document to get merged, and I think that's not even necessary for that doc.
Yeah, better not to in this, right?
Yeah, because it falls. I think it kind of falls underneath this group, SIG cluster lifecycles, both release and cluster lifecycle, about what the management of that means, and what the version matrix is.
Yeah, for especially things like CRI, CNI, at some level, the support that Kubernetes has ends at the API boundary. Like we support these versions of the APIs, and we have we're required to maintain compatibility per whatever stated compatibility guarantees we have are. The particular container runtimes we test with is useful information, but I think the APIs are really the guarantees that we make, and that gives a hook for runtime providers to say, oh well, our runtime has been tested and provides these versions of the container runtime API, rather than kind of king making, saying this particular container runtime is tested and supported, and all the other ones, like you're on your own.
Yep, we've always been in that boat. Like we have to choose. The problem is, in order to give a result, you need to actually test against something,
Yes.
right? So it's where the rubber meets the road versus ideology, what we should do, right? Versus
the other thing to keep in mind is that something like kubeatom can be more opinionated. It has a particular topology that it deploys with, but if the low-level components, the binaries themselves, are being used with other topologies, they have to be aware of that. And so this document in particular is intended to be useful for users to know if the topology and upgrade mechanisms and how they're rolling things out falls within the bounds of what the project is expecting. And it's also important as we are reviewing changes and deciding what is acceptable to put into a release to know if a change that someone's wanting to make would violate some of these ordering guarantees, or would need to be rolled out over a longer period of time, whatever.
I think we're in violent agreement.
Yep.
Let's merge it.
If anyone's interested, on Thursday, I threw it on the SIGARCH agenda as well. So I expect we'll have a similar conversation there, and all nod violently and agree that there's 100 more questions we need to answer.
Cool.
Yep.
Anything else then on that PR that folks want to discuss?
I did want to your comment about downgrade, Tim. I think I want to capture where we currently are with what is tested and supported, and we do have a downgrade test which is flaky, but is also release blocking if it is solid red. So
yeah, there's
from a support perspective, like with a release team hat on, I would argue that downgrade is not supported. Release blocking, yeah, but who owns fixing it? Somebody at Google cares about that. We can't reliably get them to care about it. Last week or the week before KubeCon China, Google folks told me like actually they don't care about it. They're thinking about spending some time next year trying to make it work reliably.
I would disagree with that, actually. Yeah. I think anyone who does rolling upgrades cares about downgrade working, whether they know it or not. If you are upgrading, if you're doing a rolling upgrade and you expect to be able to roll back if the first one that comes up encounters problems, then you rely on downgrade working.
Yeah,
sure.
So
but
I
was
think this
only
is like
disagreeing with the support it, like tested and support it, users want it. Support it, it's a very weak area.
So in Sid Cluster Lifecycle, we've had this conversation many, many times. And I have longstanding strong beliefs on the idea of immutability for your infrastructure versus having a sort of self-hosted rolling update type of topology for your deployments, as far as maintenance and security concerns and a bunch of other constraints around the space. I think, I don't necessarily know if we want to take up that conversation here. I do think that it kind of bleeds over this space. We could have an entire discussion just on downgrades and immutability, downgrades versus rolling updates versus immutability, and how you do A versus B and why what are the requirements and what are the benefits and what are the costs, right? So
I agree. I want to recognize where we are and make clear what scenarios are currently tested so that users understand where we're at and we are aware of the consequences of any changes people propose. So if we're testing a rolling upgrade downgrade and someone wants to make a change that would break that, we need to consider that proposal with eyes open, saying this is going to lose us this level of support. I don't disagree that the support is weak, but it is present, and we need to decide if we want to strengthen that or abandon it. And both of those, there are reasons in favor of both of those that we need to think through. What I don't want to do is to say the support is weak, so let's equate that with we don't support it at all. And as soon as you give up that test, it will immediately be broken, and then the decision has kind of been made without consideration. So.
Yeah, I guess my worry from the release team is that it's weak to the point of rounding to zero, but it's hard to say for sure without a lot more user feedback how well people actually exercise it and what their experiences are.
Yeah, I think getting clarity on what is actually being tested and what it would take to get strong support there is the first step.
Yeah, that's one of the things I guess to say, like for a lot of what this work group is doing is like defining what aspirations are going to be. And some of that's going to be big conversations like this one, like Tim was saying, like we could have massive conversations on philosophy here. But
I was about to make a suggestion that I think we've sort of run the risk of diving too deep on individual things too early. I wonder if it isn't a good idea to use the first 1 or 2 meetings here to do 2 things. One is to like draw a bounding box around what we're actually going to talk about at all, and explicitly exclude the other stuff. And then secondly, within that bounding box, break it into areas that we believe that we're interested in, and then carve out specific times to, say, in January, we're going to spend, 2 hours figuring this area out, and then we're going to move on to the next area. And we know we've got, 5 areas or whatever they are, and therefore the end goal is February, we have 5 of these areas fleshed out. Because I've got a fear that there is so much detail in here that we could just wander around aimlessly in the detail for months on end and perhaps not end up in a useful place.
Yeah, I think that's a good transition maybe to the next thing that probably should have been first then on the agenda. I mean, Jordan's PR being in flight, like it's good to get documented where we are today, but then as a working group charter, what are we going to declare in scope and out of scope, deliverables, timelines, sorts of stuff. There's been a smattering of comments on that PR there, but everybody here, I would love to have you all chiming in and reviewing, acting, proposing changes. Are there folks who have read it who have thoughts?
I personally have not. I was just wondering, I mean, it seems like if we're dealing there with version compatibility and skews between masters and nodes and these kinds of things, I'm not even necessarily convinced that that is the core of long-term support. I think it's a potentially a small part of it, but I'm curious whether the feeling in the group is that this is like the central issue related to long-term support or not.
I think we should probably break down and enumerate the state space of problems. And I think that kind of leads into the next topic that Tim wrote down there is like the questionnaire. Like I have a lot of feedback, but it's very noisy, opinionated feedback from customers and users. And I think having, actual good signal from a wider swath of the ecosystem would be super beneficial to make informed decisions.
Yeah, obviously people who are having trouble today are liable to show up in this forum, but that doesn't mean there isn't an overwhelming set of people who are happy today also. So like there's data to collect. Justin Santa Barbara, hand up.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, like, I presume Jordan's goal was that an LTS would mean skipping versions, and we have to, or would presumably mean skipping versions, and we have to be aware of the SKU policy in that. But I also wanted to clarify that, or ask a question, which is, I think Jordan's done a great job of documenting the current SKU policy, but I wanted to be sure that we consider changing that SKU policy to be in scope, right? In other words, if we decide we need seamless upgrade downgrade across multiple skipping versions, we can change that policy, or we can address changing that policy in this working group.
Yeah, I think that's one of the outcomes, and what I tried to, so because this has the potential to ramble and also rat's nest get very opinionated, a working group isn't necessarily required to have a charter, but by putting something out there that says, like, here are the things we think are in scope, out of scope, possible deliverables, this could be just a set of point changes to how we do things in cluster lifecycle, in release, or it could be something broader like changing the SKU policy, but that it's open. Because you got to have a name for the group, and when you say working group LTS, like, people kind of have a sense of it, but then some of the people are going to be like, oh, you're talking about multi-year support with version jumping SKUs, and oh, blah, we don't want to go there. And so we're going to have some very strong opinions on all sides on this, but to make sure that we do approach it with an open mind, that any of these could be possible outcomes. Jordan.
Yeah, I had lots of goals for that doc. One was to help users, one was to help us know what was in bounds for changes made in a release, and one is to expose ways that our test matrix is not covering what we say we support today, so that to help inform questions like, oh, well, sure, let's increase SKU policy to 4 versions or 6 versions or whatever, and kind of have a light on, okay, what do we actually need to test if we're going to do that? And how do our change policies need to be adjusted if we're going to do that? So that we don't make a decision based on, oh, well, users want it, we want a checkbox on our LTS page, sure, let's do it, and not realize, what are we actually signing up for?
Yeah.
And there's the whole cost aspect too there. Like, I mean, does it slow down pre-submits? Does it slow down, does it literally cost more in dollars? Do we all need to pool money into the CNCF for test infra? Like, if we go there would have to be a very detailed, concrete plan that makes it viable. And that's not something we're going to quickly, easily decide.
Yeah, I think another important area of bounding this problem space is what do we consider to be the responsibility of the Kubernetes project versus what do we assume to be the responsibility of distro vendors, essentially. And obviously there's some incentive to, if every one of the 100 distro vendors is going to go and solve exactly the same problem in a different way somewhere out there, then there's some argument for pushing that upstream. But at the same time, we can't try and do everything that all distro vendors want done, because that's very expensive for an open source project to do. So I think trying to figure out where that line is pretty useful.
Something I brought up last meeting. I know several folks weren't able to make it, but just thinking in terms of APIs rather than binary versions. So today, people think in terms of, oh, I have a 111 cluster, I have a 112 cluster, I have a 113 cluster. And our REST APIs are versioned and have pretty detailed compatibility requirements. If you write something against the apps v1 deployments API, you expect submitting that deployment to behave the same, even if you're on a 1.9, 1.10, 1.11. It doesn't matter what version API server, your expectation is that it continues working the same way. Getting to the same place for driving configuration of the components I think would be a really positive outcome. So that rather than thinking in terms of, oh, I have a 111 API server or a 113 API server, you say, this is my API server config and it's versioned, and I expect when I start the API server that this version configuration will continue to work for the life cycle of this config file version. And then we can start to fold that into and make it the same sorts of timeline promises that we do for the REST APIs, so that you can have expectations about how the components behave. I think thinking in terms of APIs makes a lot more sense over the lifespan of a cluster, and for people who are kind of writing to it. Whereas today we have like 1,000 ad hoc flags, and it's very difficult to know whether a new flag is going to be required or something like that. It's hard to sketch out kind of an upgrade plan or a cluster lifecycle plan.
Echoing what Quentin said about like vendors doing things in parallel or coordinating efforts, I think this is one of the key places, like LTS ideas aside, like getting these interfaces, more of them to a stable and known place. If we as a community make sure that we've enumerated and are focusing, and vendors are working together to get some of those things more shored up, we get to a better place. Because I think that users hear this idea of kernel versus distro, they've maybe seen Linux and that sort of stuff as a model in LTS, and they have conceptions. But Linux came from an easier space, I feel. Like the user space boundary versus the kernel was more well known, and like nobody talks about what version of POSIX their kernel supports. Like we should have the same sort of thing, like that the APIs are just stable and mature enough that you can rely on them. Justin, was your hand up there?
It sort of was. I was just wondering, like today we don't have, like V1 of the pod API is not sufficient, right? Because we add fields to V1 of pod, right? So that's sort of, I think, why people, maybe that's one of the reasons why people consider the Kubernetes version, and we would have to start getting stricter about that. Jordan, question mark?
Some of it is, if you have a cluster that works and you upgrade, you would expect those same manifests to continue working. And that is true, even with additions of fields. The same is not true with how components are started with command line flags today. So if I have a script that starts a component, sometimes a new flag will be required, sometimes an existing flag will be removed, and the way that is done and sort of the behavior of a component when started with the same invocation is not as principled as what the API objects do.
We certainly need to tackle that, but I mean, today, if I have a pod that, like we introduced the taint field, for example, or the toleration field, and if I bring back, it's still V1 of pod, I could put that pod against an older cluster and it would not work, and it would still be V1 of pod. So today, V1 of core API is not sufficient.
I'm speaking narrowly of the taking a working cluster and upgrading it.
Okay.
Sorry, Justin, just to clarify, were you implying almost the opposite, taking an application that runs on a working cluster and then trying to run it on an older cluster that is in theory API compatible?
Exactly. I'm saying that the API version is not sufficient to make that guarantee today. And I used a slightly specious example where we spend like, I think, 10 versions of Kubernetes. But you know, I think the point, that's sort of the problem, that I think that's one of the reasons why API version today is not sufficient and we rely on the Kubernetes version.
Some of the issues we have around the REST APIs would be easier with config because we don't have to round trip them and serve them out to components of different SKU. Like you provide a config to the component and it can do things like warn you, or you can run it in strict mode and it can fail. And so some of the things that we did in the REST APIs are easier with config. Tim had his hand up.
Tim's hands up, yeah.
So I think we're clearly crossing the boundary line into API machinery, and like we could probably feed requirements to API machinery of what it means. Like I think we might even be like a requirements/policy group for a while to possibly create policies and a set of requirements that other SIGs could adhere to, so that we can actually create a supportive model. But I think we're deep into the land right now of the details. And ideally, I would like to like maybe pop up the stack so that we can start to focus on what should be our charter and how we should start to address some of these really thorny set questions, right?
Totally agree. And I was trying to, in my initial draft of the charter, I tried to stay away from some of those lower level details, but Brian Grant's comment was like, no, you must declare they are your key stakeholders. And yes, like technically whatever is decided, those are going to be the SIGs that are implementing stuff, yeah, but there's a higher level architectural, what do we want the shape of things to be question. And sure, it's got to be doable, but I think we have a set of people here who are going to understand that part as well and pull in representation from those SIGs, not like just come at them and say like, you must now implement this policy that has been decided. Like that's not how the community works in the first place either. So
I do think the questions we ask at the beginning are going to shape the direction that we go. So asking questions, I think the survey is a good starting point. And asking questions, how do you interact with upgrades? What's painful? What is broken? What are you doing to address it? How often are you upgrading? How are you upgrading? Without kind of presuming mechanisms or strategies for staying up to date or handling migrations or whatever people are doing. I think the information gathering step is really important as a starting point.
So survey then, and also officially I was trying to keep this meeting to 45 minutes so people can actually have a break between, but that was next on the agenda was to talk about the survey. So I guess I'll just say like folks try and review that and think about the things that we've just discussed there and whether there's gaps in what we've got there initially as some things that we want to try to capture as we put it out for discussion. And then I think the last item on the agenda we should bump to the next meeting or a later meeting. But if folks could, especially on the charter discussion, do some reviewing in scope, out of scope. And like Quentin was saying, like, let's think about some actual timeline. What should we focus on first and second and third a little bit to have a little bit of clarity over the first few months what we do. Obviously, as the year progresses, things are fuzzier the further out we get, but make sure that we're focused and biting off things and making some progress towards actions. So anything else anybody wants to add today?
So I wanted to have put some bounds on the timeline for survey so that we can use this for the KubeCon conference, the Seattle conference. So any comments or suggestions on how do we do this faster?
So we have barely 2 weeks then.
Yeah.
We would need to really get people to pounce and review and then see if we can actually get it out ahead of that. I think if we have it solidified and ready to go and socialize the idea that it's coming at KubeCon, that could be viable too. Tim? You unmuted? Yeah.
I think we need to start the socialization process. I don't think you can time box yet. I think it's way too early, given the fact that this is a community-based project. You need to have that shared distributed understanding, which takes a long time, and you need to evangelize in multiple forums. This is only one forum of a group of people who are interested in this topic, but it will have vast implications across the entire project. So you need to be able to socialize across that whole, horizontally across all of the SIGs.
Do you think that's necessary though for the survey, like to define what questions we would ask in the near term?
I think that it would affect them. I think you need to socialize with the other SIGs that, you know, what questions are you interested in to answer, and what data have you seen, right?
That makes sense, yeah. So we can take that as an action for the coming weeks to get out to other SIGs, do some of that, and then also at KubeCon. And mentioned this in the Slack channel, but we are on the agenda for the Contributor Summit. We've got a 50-minute slot to talk. It said release engineering, but the idea was they wanted us to kind of present where we are, what we're thinking, the start of this work group, and get some more socialization to things. So we've got some good opportunity for that coming up. All right, so then thank you all for joining. I will post this to YouTube shortly, hopefully, and we will start iterating. Please put comments on the charter, the survey, Jordan's PR there. Let's get this ball rolling. Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks, Tim.